All right, well, Steve, thank you so much for joining us today.
I am happy to be here. Thank you.
Of course, us, I guess just us,
Just the
because
two of us.
we're in a room in the Huntington Library. It's a quiet study room, and we are studying all things fantasy today. And you're certainly a jack of all trades. I've been interviewing a lot of Jack and Jills of all trades, and you're another one.
Thank you.
Of course, you've done a lot, and I'd like to first thank you for your service because you are a veteran of our country.
It really was a pleasure.
And how long did you serve, if you don't mind me asking?
Total, I was in the reserves.
Hmm.
So I did all my active duty training, and then complete is a little over 10 years.
10 years, okay. Wow. It's incredible. And did you get a certain insight from that, from being a veteran? Did your worldview change or anything?
I think it's fair to say that you are a product of your experiences,
Hmm.
whether they be good or they be bad. And I think it's a part of my personality, character. I hope that it's more of the good than any of the perceived bad.
Well, I can say that you taught my brother, I believe, social
think I did.
studies, and he has never forgotten that. So you could at least know you've had an impact on a lot of kids uh, as far as education goes. And I also teach history, and I think about you often actually when I do that because I think through my college experience, I had to observe some classes, and I had the pleasure of observing your
I
class.
remember.
Yeah, I had a great time. It was a really fun time.
I'll say something, if you don't mind, that I'm past my second decade teaching now. And there are a lot of younger teachers. And one of the things I try to say, because I don't want to butt in on their lives, but I really do recommend that they sit in individually, sit in other classes, whether it be the discipline that they went to school for or other, a different discipline. I think that it was not only a pleasure to sit in other people's classes, because I spent a lot of time in the beginning of my career in other people's classes just to observe how they do their thing.
Hmm.
Some people have a very natural way with students, some people are very organized. I enjoyed the different disciplines because you get to, you're really learning all the material as well. Although I did not spend enough time in math. I should have spent
Neither
more
did I.
time in math.
Oh man, God help me.
For my own kids, I had a hard time with them, my own children. But I enjoyed all the disciplines. I enjoyed the characters of the teachers because I love characters. I love stories.
I guess you are a character.
I agree.
Aren't
It depends
we
on who you
all?
ask too.
Aren't we
Which
all?
of the students that it was a positive, terrific experience, and those that it was different. But I'm fortunate that I'm still in the same district, and I live in the district connecting, adjoining, and I do still see a lot of students. They're a lot older now, and they're grown. Some of them are, near mid-30s,
Sure.
especially the ones I had in the very beginning. But it's always a positive experience. I'm happy to say that, not because we're being filmed, but it's true. They've matured. I like to think that I have matured as a teacher and as an adult as well. Um, and it's humbling too. Whenever someone says, "I remember this," I remember that lesson, and remember this. It's hard to remember everybody's name. I spoke to Mr. Eve today,
Oh yeah,
and
sure.
and very briefly, I'm sure you remember him. He's a terrific teacher, and even Mr. Eve was teaching in our school after I started, but I would observe him anyway.
Huh.
I always ask permission. I try not to interrupt. I for a lot of reasons, personal and professional. I spent a lot of time in other people's classrooms, and I'm very happy I did that. I think that is such an important thing to do to round a teacher, and maybe it's important to do to round person, see different people, interact with different people, different strata, different socioeconomic status, really different jobs.
I think you have to have a love for what you're doing to do that. So to want to be a better teacher, to be a better writer, to be a better actor, you got to get in it. You have to get out of your comfort zone and see it, learn from everything that you're looking at. And I agree with you. I think if you feel that it was a positive experience, then you're doing what you love to do, as difficult as it could be. So for two teachers who have taught, we thank all the teachers out there for what they do, because it's not an easy job, but at the end of the day, if you love what you're doing, you feel like you've really accomplished something, and the kids make you feel that way too.
I agree, and if it's all right with you, I'm going to go a step further. I think the students are super important, part of the learning, the lesson of teaching. I think that I've had very good experiences with parents, and it was a huge learning experience. I've had not so good experiences that I'm guilty. It would be untrue if I said I didn't learn more. Because at one time I wasn't a parent of teenagers, and now I am a parent of teenagers. So along the way, I like to think that I learned along the way, and I'm lucky that I have a chance to apply that now.
It's great.
With my own children, but more importantly, with the 125 kids I see every day.
Sure.
It has to be said that, and administrators, of course, but different administrators, it's all part of the job that we do.
Yeah, we're essentially establishing a community of great citizens. What we're doing, we're not just citizens of the country, citizens of the world. So it's a big job. All right. First of all, I ask this question to everyone I interview.
Okay.
What is fantasy to you? When I say fantasy, what do you think of?
I think of entertainment. I would say that I can relax and just absorb entertainment. I am a child of Lucas and Spielberg.
Sure.
To just name two. I enjoyed movies as a child, and I enjoyed what I think were great movies. Some of them were way over my head, but I, like a fine wine, I get to appreciate them with age. I can watch them again. Sometimes I even watch my own kids.
That's the best.
And we can go back and forth. That's my general idea of it.
I love it. Yeah, I love some videos. Spoiler alert, but I love some videos on YouTube where the father is taping. He's watching Star Wars with his daughter or his son, and then they find out that Darth Vader is Luke's father. Sure. And it's so adorable to me because it still holds up. It's one of the greatest plot twists in any fantasy, in any movie, really. It was just so well delivered, so well done, that this terrible human being, right, that we see, through this dark side realm is your father, and yet you can break that mold, and you can bring him to the light in the end. It's just such a great thing, and I think fantasy has an ability to do that. It takes modern themes, or even past themes, and it puts it in this magical show, as you said, and it makes you feel something. So even if it's just entertainment, in the end, like you just said, you knew what you were watching, that you were feeling something. It had an impact on you. So I agree with you, because I've interviewed many people, and fantasy for them is not in a book. Fantasy, in many cases, is watching a new show, a hit show. I think a lot of people who watch, like Game of Thrones, for instance, if you ask them, what's that book from? Oh, Game of Thrones. It's not called Game of Thrones, but the show is called Game of Thrones. And that's not bad on them. It isn't, because they didn't know. And the great thing is the show revealed that to them. So I agree with your assessment. It is entertainment, and that's why it's so much fun.
My wife and I, we watched Rocky with our kids.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And I was a little kid when that came out. But we watched it, and we didn't tell them anything about it until that fantasy. What someone's expectation is. Everything is going to be great. And then, well, we know how it ends. And one of my daughters was, I'm going to say, distraught. But she was angry. She was upset. How could this happen? How can he lose? I said, well, the fantasy was to win.
Interesting.
But the reality is he was a part of something tremendous. And then we binged the rest of the movies.
Yeah.
We had to. We couldn't stop. We couldn't go to bed that night until I think we watched Rocky 3. But it was like watching it through her eyes. She had a certain fantasy, and I don't know if I was the same age as her. Maybe I was younger when I saw it the first time. So a lot of the things went over my head, but that's fine. Still understood the story, or I thought I did. On a young person's perspective, I understood. Maybe she was a teen, and maybe I was 10. Maybe. It was almost more enjoyable watching it with her, with them. I have 3 daughters, because they were seeing it for the first time.
That's the best feeling.
It was pretty cool.
It's great.
It was pretty cool.
Wow. There's nothing like watching something fantastic again with someone with new eyes, because you wait for that reaction. Yeah, that's how I felt too when I saw it the first time.
It's sort of like everything that we do every day. We're teaching history to students who don't have a lot of history. They're 10, 12, 12 or 13 or 14. You teach, do you teach 9th grade?
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe they're a little bit older. Maybe they're a little bit wiser, but they're all of our students are close in age. Some of these great things, or not so great things, it's new to them. And every once in a while, I don't know if you have it in your classroom, I'm sure you do, somebody's disappointed, or somebody's excited,
or really upset.
Where did that come? Oh, that's where that came from. That's a great moment.
See, I'm really glad you brought that up. That was another one of my questions, which is, this is crazy, but it's sort of a big topic. Fantasy can be anything you want it to be. It's up to the storytellers to decide, and there's rules to that story. Once you've developed a world, now the characters are a part of that world. But in history, you can't just change the ending of the story. It happened. And the most important thing we can do, I think you agree with me, is to teach the truth, to teach what happened in our past, and let the kids decide. Because I love dropping bombshells, because the kids think it's like a movie. What's going to happen? And then you think, this is history. This is all something that actually occurred. The stories of the ancient Romans alone. I mean, they've made series out of it, and they've sort of made it a little fantastical. But for the most part, history, love it or hate it, doesn't have anything to do with your feelings or where you've grown up or what you believe in. It's there. It's all there that led us to where we are today. And it could solve a lot of problems. If everyone just looks at where we've come from, or where a belief system materialized, or why people are protesting something, or why someone is angry about a movie that came out that was supposed to be historical but was completely wrong, and you wonder, why are you upset? It was a fun movie. Well, it wasn't historically accurate. It's not a fantasy. So history and fantasy, it's a big difference, and I wanted to get your take on that. Because where does history fit in if fantasy is involved?
Wow, that's a big question.
I thought so too.
Wow,
I
boy.
think about it all the time.
When you were speaking, I was thinking fantastical history.
Yes.
Some of it is fantastical, and some of it is very dry.
Mm.
I think it's our job, it's a hard job, to make history as fantastical as possible without embellishing it and making it fantasy. It's very difficult, but I think it's our jobs, to present a fair version of our history, of the history that we're teaching, which is sometimes difficult.
Mm.
Very rarely in my classroom do I say, this is my opinion. Rarely. Only when I'm pointing out a true, undeniable wrong. For instance, I'll say, when we cover the Civil War, pre-Civil War, so I make it a point to say, slavery is never good. It was a system, I'll point that out, let's say, but nobody in their right mind, say that's probably harsh, but I'll say nobody can argue this was a good system and that it should have continued, because it is undeniably wrong for the people in bondage. Let's be very clear on that. And several other times throughout our curriculum, unless questions come up. That's a difficult thing to do, to try to present both sides, because I'm sure your students ask you all the time, what do you think?
All the time.
And I always tell them, it's not fair for me to share. It's not fair. But look at this and look at that. They're a little bit older and a little bit more savvy. I connect a lot of links. Say, read this, check it out. Read it now, read it in a week from now. Maybe you'll have a different opinion once you've thought about it a little bit. And then let's talk about it. Read this, read that. Check this out, videos, check that out. Documentaries, perhaps. I attach a lot of stuff. So they have a plethora to choose from. Make up your own mind. I said, believe me, you're going to feel different when you're 20 than you do right now. And when you're 40. And when you have your own children. I said, the whole thing changes.
Yeah.
And maybe that's a good thing. Maybe with a little time and a little bit more experience, you can see things different.
It's the whole key. That's why I think history is so important, so pivotal. And I think I would dare to say that knowing history helps you appreciate fantasy even more. Because fantasy pulls a lot from mythology, things that we've sort of created in our lore, whether it's lore of our creation or lore of tales. What do you call it? They come up with stories that mean something.
Allegories?
Like allegories, exactly. Things like that.
I sat in that class in English. No, that's not true.
Okay.
My wife is an English teacher. We do talk about this and that. But allegory, and I only remember that because of Watership Down, right?
Yeah.
Rabbits. It's a story told through rabbits.
I'm glad that you brought that up because...
Wow.
No, seriously, because history, you can't see it from only one side of the coin. You have to see it from both sides. And, being a teacher, as you were saying, having opinions, you have to tell the kids, you need to understand that before you have a thought, before you have an opinion of your own, you need to know both sides. You got to see this side and that side, right? And then you understand, all right, now I can make a decision. And I think some fantasies do that. They show you that sometimes it isn't just about good and evil. It's about knowing the other side's perspective and seeing that. And I remember reading some books that brought me into a strange place that I wasn't used to. And sometimes it was animals that did that for me. Like that book, the graphic novel Mouse.
I was just thinking about that.
Yeah, that I think everyone brings that up when they think of graphic novels and in such a horrible time. But I felt through animals because I knew it wasn't animals, that they were people. But that in a sense is a fantasy, but the event wasn't. And it's a very interesting way that you can sort of teach it to kids, to say, yeah, they're bunnies. What if they were people? You know, they're mice, but what if those were actually people? It gets you to think, and some kids, like you said before, they need to learn these things in stages. They need to understand, back then, things were different. Why did he do that? Why did any army do what they do? And if you go back into it and you look at the history of it, there's always a why and a how and a because. And I think good fantasies do that. That you can live in that world, feel like this is like my world. I feel like I'm in a history right now, but it's their history. So it doesn't affect me as much, but I still hate the fact that this happened to that make-believe character, because that's how politics are in history, but it also applies to the fantasy. It's
Right.
interesting. Interesting dichotomy.
I was thinking of, you said Star Wars,
Yes.
and I did this interesting lesson where I was comparing World War II and Star Wars,
Oh, wow.
and tie in imperialism in Star Wars, and the imagery. The imagery is very important, but also the history of the Jedi as compared to the samurai, and the codes, and the weapons and solitary lives, and the uniforms of the Empire, and it's called the Empire. And Darth is dark, and Vader means father, which I didn't know.
Oh, I didn't know that.
I didn't know that until I looked it up.
You're
It was
kidding.
something else. Vader is German for father, as far as
I just
I know.
learned something. I had no idea. I thought there was a spoiler in his name.
I just thought it was, as a kid. I was 6 or 7 years old in 1977, and I thought, Luke Skywalker. I'm like, wow, that's an interesting name. Oh, and he lives in space. Like, I recognized it as a child. Even Han Solo, I recognized that he was on his own. I knew what the word solo meant, but I never, as a child, understood it as a character name, and that's part of the character. And Skywalker is just that. Chewbacca confused me, but I had friends even when I was 7 or 8, and I understood. Your friends are your friends, and you're lucky to have them.
It's great. Yeah, exactly. That's a good point. You didn't know what he said, but you knew through his emotion what he meant, what he felt. I like that with Groot in Guardians of the Galaxy.
Right.
I am Groot. I am Groot. I am Groot. And I saw a funny meme online. It said Groot being asked to apologize for his hurtful comment on Twitter, and the comment is, "I am Groot."
Yeah.
I love it. All right, so this is a good one. I believe you yourself are writing right now. What inspired you to take on writing, if you don't mind me asking?
I wanted to try something that I've never done before on any level of success. I was writing a lot of in the classroom, and for one lesson, I wrote an example of yellow journalism, and I thought it was pretty good. I looked at all the different ways that yellow journalism used based on history, and then I just
For
applied.
those who don't know what yellow journalism is.
Sensational writing. It was popular at the turn of the 20th century. But before the 20th century, yellow journalism sort of starts the
Spanish-American.
Spanish-American War, Hearst versus Pulitzer, who could sell the most newspapers,
So
who's
that,
got the most exaggerated stories. So I wrote one,
huh?
but as a lesson. I wrote an exaggerated story about these dress codes that were coming to schools, and that all cell phones will be deactivated in school, and every kid has to wear jumpsuits, and school on Saturday, and all of the points that I thought would really upset them. It upset them. My intention was to read this 1 or 2 pages and have the kids would have a visceral experience. Oh, whatever it is, anger and upset, nervousness, I got it all. And then after we read this, and I made crazy names like, for all the different quotes. Finally, the kids figured out this isn't a real name. And they tried to get their computers out and look up the article online, and they couldn't find it because it didn't exist. And then someone said, "Did you make this up? Are you pulling my leg?" And, the person was angry. And I said, "Yeah." And they were like, "Well, why'd you do that?" And some kids were very relieved. Oh, thank God. Oh, one kid was like, "I'm telling my mother and father, and this isn't true. This can't happen. We have to move." There was a lot going on because they're 13-year-old kids and they have a certain sense of their own identity. And then we went into yellow journalism. They were like, "Oh, wow, now I understand." But I had a feeling throughout my career, I've tried to do that. Not to drive them crazy or upset anybody purposefully, but to get a reaction. And it's not always easy and it's not always applicable, but I try. Sometimes it's photographs. Sometimes, I'm sure you do the same thing. You analyze photos, you give the backstory. I had an assignment once where I just had the kids find the pictures, and they handed them to other people, and they wrote about the picture without knowing anything about it.
Sure.
All they did was write about the picture. They had a kind of a time period, what was going on, tell me about the people in the picture. So I don't know if that was creative writing, but it sparked my interest.
Interesting.
Then I had them write factual. Now find the picture online. Now do research on the picture. Tell me what actually happened. It was, there were different levels of success, of course, but it was interesting to see the kids work. It was very nice.
You saw them use their imagination, I guess, what was in the picture, what it could mean.
And their skills of deduction. Let me explain exactly what's here. One photo was like the Vietnam era, and another photo was the Civil War, but it could have been like a candid shot. And then throughout our, Civil War to modern times, pretty modern times, whether it was serious inside of a nuclear silo, or it was just somebody pumping gas. It was pretty interesting. I'm very happy I did it. We did it. I used it a few times, but then I kind of get bored and move on to something else.
Sure. And that got your creative juices flowing for yourself to think that you had an idea, you had thoughts that you had to put down. Because I know the feeling. I was there too. Sometimes it's difficult to sleep because you say, I gotta write this down, I gotta put this down somewhere.
Earlier we were talking about exercising before we started the video. And I like to think when I go for a run and I come back, I'm trying to work something out. Sometimes I do that. I only get a half an hour in, but I just concentrate on one thing, on the wording of something, on a little idea. Do I expand this idea? Do I keep it small? I go to parties. You go to parties, and we have families, and we have friends, and we have friends of friends, and you mingle, and ultimately, there's always groups of people, chit-chatting. And sometimes I enter, and sometimes I chit-chat, and sometimes I just listen. I love stories. Something kept coming up in all the conversations that made me think about questions. So I started writing questions down. And that was the basis of my first endeavor, writing.
It's incredible.
And then I had a completely different set of ideas, and I started to write questions about a completely different topic. And I kept asking my wife, I said, do you think I could do this? I have this idea. Do you mind if I dedicate a little time to it? And she said, yeah, go ahead. You think it's important? Well, go ahead. It wasn't any time I was taking away from anything else, but it was a little free time. And I had a lot of free time. So I decided, let me see where these notes go. And my children were actively playing sports and was going back and forth to practice a lot. So instead of dropping them off, I used to sit in the parking lot and write notes. I also graded papers when I had to grade papers. I ran errands when I had to run errands. I didn't dedicate every moment of every day to writing, but one thing led to another because a person's walking by and I was like, wow, that person's carrying a lot of bags. I want, baggage. How do I work that in? How does that fit here? And I was working on two projects at the same time. And I kept asking her, how does this work? What do you think about this? And she said, look, put one down. I'm just, which one do you like better? I said, well, I love them both. These are all my ideas, right? And she said, work on one, put the other one down. And that's exactly what I did. But that was difficult because I didn't stop thinking about the other book.
Sure, yeah, I know.
I just kept filing away every time I go for a jog. I think about this a little bit. And I tried to write 10 pages. And I sat down one day with my notes and I wrote 10 pages. And I was like giggly, is like I was very happy to be here right now. I was so excited to tell my wife, I have 10 pages written. And she very casually said, I'm proud of you. Now write 10 more. And I did. And then I just kept going and going and going. But I didn't work every day. When I exhausted an idea, I just stopped. Like, that's the end of a chapter. And I moved on.
I'll tell you what. So I had read some of your writing. And it's very well done. And the way you sort of presented it to me was, it's a rough draft. It's a rough draft. It's a rough draft. But I'm reading it and I'm saying, I'm forgetting that this is a rough draft. I'm actually enthralled in these guys' stories. So
considering all of your awards and accolades, that's terrific. Thank you. I really appreciate that. But when I came in to today to meet David, he handed me a book, and that's the holy grail as far as I'm concerned. I'm like, wow, mine's still on paper from the copy machine. Yeah. So I'm totally impressed. Thank you very much. For any kind words or any suggestions would be greatly appreciated.
Oh yeah, suggestions are big. I gave you one of my suggestions, right. But then as I read further, I realized that suggestion couldn't work. As I got further, I was thinking putting it in like a first-person context. But then I saw, I don't want to give the movie away, but when I saw the story, it was progressing, that there's really two characters we're looking at here eventually. That's what it turns into.
Right.
I said, okay. Now you could still have a first person at one time and then a first person to another, but I can see the flow of writing that you had, that you were seeing it from a narrator's perspective. And I know what that's like. I've written a short story compilation book where it was first person, the next story was a totally different story, third person, back and forth, and it's a whole new experience. It's a whole new grammar. Grammar alone, everything changes.
My spelling has gotten much better.
All right, because your spelling looked fine to me.
That's because you see the cleaner copy of a rough draft.
Okay.
It was like a red rug It was terrible. It was terrible.
We've all
It was
been there,
terrible.
man. I've been there myself.
I don't know how many times I spelled restaurant wrong.
Oh, me too.
And I had to go back
Without spell
and
check.
correct it. I was most concerned about just getting my thoughts down.
Yes,
And
that's the key.
it is a pleasure. It's incredibly frustrating when you can't get the words out, but they're in your mind. You want to say this a certain way. 2 pages later, I really want someone to reflect back on this. That's I don't exactly know how to do that. I'm just giving it my best effort.
That's it. I've done in the past. I knew I could have said something better, but I said something and I just put it in parentheses, meaning go back to it with another mind in the future, and it might be different. And sometimes I got the book back and I've used words that are completely wrong because of my grammar. Like shuddering is very different from shuttering, and I put shuttering instead of shutter. Those little things, some people don't realize it, but other people are like, oh my gosh, there's a spelling error, there's a grammatical error. And it could affect, I've read books with grammatical errors, and my books had grammatical errors. And I've had to go through a long journey to get it to where it is today. My books had no accolades, no awards, and it took me a lot of reflection. Say, all right, I gotta go back into this. Maybe this was very immature. I could do a much better job. And you mature as a writer, and that's what I see here. You're maturing. You're getting better as you go. And that's the thing. A lot of people don't even try. They just say, I can't. Just outline it. Put something on. You'll be surprised what you can do.
You know, my second work, I took a very different approach. I wrote it from page 1 to the end. My first book, you're reading it now, I didn't. I wrote it chapter by chapter, all over the place. Whatever was on my mind that day. And it was like I wrote everything on index cards. And they were all like paper clipped together, bound together. And I would pull, if I'm going to soccer practice, I would bring the paper clips out, like one of the bound groups of index cards. And that's what I would work on. And then I was done with that, I would put it in a different pile and just like kind of pick and choose. Oh, I think I'll do this today. And I would do that. And then I wouldn't touch it for a week. Just kind of let it simmer. And I know I'm dying to ask you a question.
Yeah, sure.
What's your process? Do you go start the end? Do you write everything you can think of and then give it to a beta reader and say, hey, how do I make this all work? Or I'm dying to know.
Yeah, you know what? Thanks for asking that. So my process, it varies from book to book. Sometimes I'll think, well, that's a cool idea, but I'm not interested in writing it. Maybe I'll write a short story one day. But then it picks at you and you're like, all right. And you sit down and you say, you know what, let me outline something. Do I have something? Because this sounds really cool and I'm sort of inspired by this sort of conundrum. And I'll start to outline things and then I'll realize, you know what, yeah, this is something. And I put it there. And then I'll work on it and I'll outline some more. And then I'll do more research on the topic. So it takes pressure off me. I don't have to write this right now, but I'm thinking about it. So I'm researching what I would like to do, what the problem could be, what characters would be involved in this, and it begins to grow. And then that's when I really start to outline my ideas. My outline is not a beautiful looking thing. It could be in a napkin, and I usually put it in notes, and it looks very silly to other people, but to me, I know what I'm looking at. It's my mind on the paper. My process is, the basic things you learn in English. What's the setting? What is the basic plot? And what are the basic characters involved? And you work through them, and you start writing it. You put it on paper with your outline there, and then you think of events, because you don't just come up with it and say, oh, I know what I'm going to do now. Oh, I have an idea. You could do that for fun, for a creative writing practice that could turn into something else. But I remember every time I had an idea, I would write it down in an outline. I'd say, this should happen, and this will need to happen then, because then this has to be resolved. And I'm not writing a story, I'm just outlining what would need to happen, like you're writing a textbook. And then eventually you start to write it out. And sometimes you say, you know what, I wanted this to happen, but the characters are taking themselves in a different direction.
Right.
I'm going to have to follow them now. This is not what this character would do. Right? I'm not going to force this character. I've seen it many times in movies and shows that they just write a character to do something. And you've grown with this character for how many seasons, and you think, this character would not do that. Whoever forced that writing in there doesn't know what they're talking about. You know, so
Makes a lot of sense.
yeah, your story begins to write itself.
As a fan, as entertainment, when something like that occurs, you say,
Why's the vote? Why'd they do that?
I was already a fan. Now I'm like, drop the ball on it.
Because you're following that character now. You know that character would do something. So the process for me changes about halfway through when I know my characters now have set attributes and characteristics. They would act a certain way. If someone spit on the ground near them, one of them would not think anything of it, and the other one would say, did you see what that guy just did? You just know it's going to turn into something.
Sure.
You know? And then the ending is the most important part for me. The ending, many times I've seen movies, books, shows, they cannot stick the landing.
Right.
They got this whole great setup, and then they go in a room and they say, how do we end this? How do we do this? And sometimes they think, let's do it artfully. Why don't we just get an end to this person's story in this case? Some sort of satisfaction of, you close a book and you say, wow, I got to think about that for a second. You know, that's a great ending. That's what you want to look for. So the whole ending, basically will highlight everything that led you up to this point. Like you'll say, wow, that makes sense. Oh, I get it now. And that, for me, is the process. And usually writing a book takes a year. My first book took about 5 years to write. I didn't know what the heck I was doing, really. I just had a story, like you did. Same thing with me. I went through this whole process. And then you start to learn what your writing process is. And the editing process is crazy. But during my book, actually, I would talk to close friends of mine who are very learned in fantasy. And I would say to them, I'm thinking of this happening. And they'd say, no, that wouldn't make sense. He wouldn't just let that go. He'd just say something else. And I'd think about it and say, yeah, he does have a point. So you're writing something, but you only know so much about people's experiences. So we talked about beta reading. It does help to talk with someone else about what a character would do in this situation. All that comes together in writing a book. And it should be a really exciting process, fun, and you shouldn't be afraid of making mistakes. You should just go for it. And then you clean it up as you go along. And you make changes and you say, you know what? I've changed one of my books so dramatically because it just happened that way. I said, well, this wouldn't happen. So why did I say that? And one instance changed everything, and I thought it made it much better.
That makes sense.
I said, my goodness, I have to change everything now. But I wasn't afraid to change it. So, yeah, every author has a different process, but I think it all comes down to planning out an idea, feeling good about it, and not being afraid to take the story to the characters and see where they take it.
That's good. I'm going to remember that.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I got 2 more questions for you.
Sure, yeah.
Let's finish this up, because this is one of my favorite interviews of all time. Now, we've spoken a lot. What is this here? Wow, almost an hour. I'm just going to say it's 45 minutes, but to me, I'm going to push it to an hour, because it's terrific. Like a long time. Okay, so if you were in a fantasy book, or a game, or a movie, which one would you want to be in?
Wow, that's I did not expect that.
I know. That's one of my favorites.
I don't know if I have a definitive answer for you right now. I enjoy the process. I feel like, although I haven't written anything close to what you've written, and I'm not anywhere near the level. It's just different. But I feel like I'm in the story. I'm experiencing my stories. I'm not necessarily any of the characters, but maybe a part of the character.
So you feel like you're a part of the story you're writing right now, or
This
when,
particular story that I'm working on now, I am not one of the characters yet. I just started.
Mhm.
But I want to be in the story. I'm a character looking in. I feel like the narrating the story is being part of that fantasy.
All right. Well, to that aspect, to that effect, then I'll ask you the next question, which is really going to narrow things down. So, being in a story, what would be then your character archetype? Because you said, because it's usually warrior, archer, but you came up with the title today, wizard. I said, what would you want to be? And you were like, what's the wizard? I said, all right. So what does wizard bring out in you? Would you actually be a wizard if you were in a fantasy world?
I was playing with back and forth with my wife. We were chit-chatting. And I said, well, I need to come up with this name. And I had this idea. And she's like, that's terrible. And then I'm like, well, what about this? And she's like, come on, you could work. You could do better than that. And I said, what about the wizard? And she laughed because we share a sense of humor. And I said, all right, well, fine, then I'll use that. We used to use the term wizard when I was in the service, like, you need to go talk to a professional. You need to go talk to the wizard. And it meant like a psychiatrist or a psychologist. Like, you got something going on that I know that's dark, but and it's in certain, I guess, literature, especially what I was comfortable, or I read a lot. That term comes up, and I thought, well, that's funny. I am telling people how to see something. I'm making decisions by writing. They're seeing it. So that's what I went with it. I thought it was just funny.
That is so cool, but I never would have known that context.
It's
wizard.
I don't know if it's a slang term or if it's. I enjoy language. I find it very interesting. Linguistics. I try to bring it into our classroom whenever we can. Language for understanding history is very, very important. It's important for understanding everything. I beg, I plead, I do everything I can to get my students to read more, especially today in 2023. And I never stop saying it's probably the most important thing that you can do to further your education on any level. I'm sure you do the same thing. I recommend it to every single parent that I ever speak to. You should go out and get your kids a subscription to National Geographic and make them read for 20 minutes. I said, if you do it, it's cool. You read half an article, they read half an article. When you're done, you spend a couple minutes with your kids talking about the article. And you take a day off and you move on to something else. You pick 3 out of 4 articles. And by the time that's done, the next magazine comes in. And who knows where down the road you're going to use that information. But reading it is very, very important. Seeing the pictures is very important. Visualizing the maps and the photos and how it all comes together. Everything's well written. Nothing is completely unavailable. You can't make available with addiction.
Sure.
And it really does, as far as fantasy goes, it really takes you to different places and maybe different times. And it's very, very visual. I would, if I could have anything in the world academically, I would love to see everybody take that piece of advice, because I love National Geographic magazine. I loved them as a kid. I read them all the time, and maybe that's what keeps the wheels turning. I don't know for sure, but I love to learn new things, and I read quite a bit, and I love magazines because I feel like I can accomplish something, in a short period of time.
Oh. Well, with that answer, I think I'm gonna end it on where we started, really, because you're the wizard, right? But in a sense, I think all teachers can be wizards. If you think about it, for what they're doing.
Sure.
I mean, the magic they gotta pull out of something.
Every day.
Every day. So we started with teachers, and I think we're gonna end with teachers on this one, because we are wizards of the magic that we can do in the classroom for kids, to make them believe that they could be successful, because that's what teaching really is. You're teaching content, but the end result is it's up to them now. Can they believe in themselves? Can they be inspired on their own? And in a sense, I think fantasy can also do that.
I agree.
So I think this was a great conversation.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I really do enjoy the time, and I'm looking forward to what comes next. Both of our careers and our endeavors.
What we got to do is turn the page
Turn the page.
and write the next one.